All right, we're all here, mostly on time. So we'll call the committee of the whole meeting for Tuesday, April 9th to order. Please call the roll.
Alderman Strelchak,
Here?
Alderman Tolaco,
Here.
Alderman Meyer, Alderman Hancher,
Here.
Alderman Bach,
Here.
Alderman Parrish,
Here.
Alderman Schneider,
Here.
Alderman Gebhardt,
Here.
and Mayor Nurbin.
Here. First up is approval of the minutes from March 12th.
Move approval.
Motion and a second. Any comments or corrections? Hearing and seeing none. All those in favor of approving the minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And the minutes are approved. Next, we have two discussion items. The first is a discussion regarding implementation of recommendations contained in the 2022 class and comp study. And Assistant Administrator Schoeneman is going to give us a little presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. So it's been a little while since we had a conversation about the compensation study, so thank you for taking some time tonight to continue our discussions. Since it's been a little bit, I was going to kick it off with a quick summary of our history to date. The compensation study itself was completed in March of 2023 with the issuance of the final report from GovHR. Shortly thereafter, the organization adopted the updated pay plan from the compensation study. From there, wage adjustments were provided to employees who were below their new pay grade minimums shortly thereafter. And going into January of this year, the third recommendation from GovHR to provide a longevity adjustment to help address some compression because of the transition and reward long-term employees was completed, which leaves us now with the fourth recommendation to address, which is a methodology to advance employees through their pay grades over their tenure with the organization. In Q3 of last year, we came forward and shared a conceptual model that had two essential prongs. The first one was the continuation of the use of a cost living adjustment and a merit increase that someone could earn based on their performance on top of that cost of living adjustment. And that merit adjustment was intended to move an employee through their pay range or their grade. The second prong that we pitched was something we termed as the bracket system, which would be an additional tool in the city's belt that would allow us to look at employees' compensation at specific year milestones. So if they hadn't progressed to where we would expect them to have progressed with good or better performance, we could provide an adjustment. So for instance, if someone hadn't completed reached Q2 in their pay range by 6 years, we could provide a market rate adjustment to that. And then same thing, if they hadn't reached the midpoint by 12 years, we suggested we could do a market rate adjustment then to bring them up to that midpoint. And listening to the council's feedback from that presentation, three themes kind of came to light. One, there's an interest in maintaining pay for performance here at the city. Two, the system needs to incentivize staff, give them something to look forward to in the pay structure versus a backstop that the bracket system kind of provided, or a safety net to the merit and COLA system. And third, the council wants to make sure that whatever we implement can help advance all employees through their pay range, through their tenure with the organization. So prior to 2014, which is the first compensation study, the organization had a STEP program in place with no merit or no performance elements to it. An employee could hit their anniversary and progress to the next step. Coming out of the 2014 study, a merit and COLA system was implemented that provided modest adjustments for employees based on individual performance. Going forward, we need to determine what 2012 and beyond is going to entail. And tonight I have a conceptual model of a hybrid that takes our two historical models and merges them together into something for conversation. It would include steps up to the midpoint, and that would provide a set increment employees with good or better performance could expect to earn over the course of a period of time. Then once they've reached that midpoint, they transition so that their full allocation for an increase year to year is purely based on performance, so it's less of a prescriptive component once you hit the midpoint forward. To make an analogy, because you could compare it to a pool, so someone is new and they're learning how to swim in the shallow end of the pool, and over their tenure, as they get better at their position and their role, they progress to the midpoint. From there, they're in the deep end, where the full increase year over year is based on their performance, and there isn't a prescribed step. So to kind of get into it a bit more, I'll show a conceptual model based off our current pay plan in a second, but there's some components that kind of go into a hybrid approach such as this. First, just like our historic pay plans, we had to make sure that we index the minimum and the maximums year over year, just in general, so we remain competitive with the market and can retain staff over the long term and attract staff too. The next component is the steps, and what I'll show in a second contemplates 8 steps to the midpoint in almost all of our pay grades, 1 through 8. And each step then reflects roughly a 2.5% adjustment, and should be noted that adjustment builds off of or compounds with the annual cost of living adjustment they use to index the ranges. So in a given year, someone could earn a step increase for satisfactory or better performance plus the COLA, so instead of just a 2.5, it could be a 3.5 or a 4.5. All depends on the number of factors, such as the city's comparables, looking at CPI and other fiscal data points. And then that same type of data would then be used to help develop a merit pool for those who are past the midpoint. Our thought is that pay grade 9, which is the last one with a number of staff in it, and our senior leadership, which is most of our departments, that one should remain or could remain fully based on performance, and there wouldn't be a set number of steps to bring them to the maximum. So up on the screen now is the current 2024 pay plan set up in this type of hybrid model. I'll see if I can zoom in just a smidgen more. There we go. You can see there's 8 steps with the eighth representing the midpoint. So employee would progress over their time to that step before it transitions to a fully merit system. And it continues for the vast majority of our positions through pay grade 8. And then 9 is fully open range. So the 2 questions that naturally arise is one, how would this hybrid concept affect our current staff? And 2, how could we go about potentially implementing this if this is a model the council is interested in us and to continue to pursue? So let's address the first one by looking at some data. So one sec, just let me switch back. So this is currently everyone in pay grade 3. Pay grade 3 includes our public works workers, so highway, parks, forestry, and sewer employees are in here as well. This also includes some administrative positions across a number of departments. So there's staff from admin, community development, and finance in this pay range too. You can see up towards the top portion of the pay range, there's 4 employees who are significantly tenured. So they've been here for 20 plus years, and they were here prior our merit system being put in place and moved up largely with the steps. The employees towards the lower end of the table here are those who have started within the last decade roughly, and the majority of them you can see are hovering around that entry-level quartile. There are a few that are higher up, and those are some administrative positions, and a couple of them are employees who received a promotion to equipment operators from their highway or parks role. So over time, if we're able to implement a hybrid system, it would have the potential to help us address that progression over time. And you can see with the, I guess, kind of maroon dots up on the screen, the compression starts to ebb, and you see people moving up over time with the steps to midpoint, after which then they would transition to the merit pool going forward. And the second question is, how could we, in theory, go about trying to implement this hybrid model if it's something the council's interested in continuing to pursue? And some ideas on how to implement it would be, one, to make sure as you go into the budget cycle this upcoming year to index our pay scale as our first order of business. Two, look to provide a 2.5% adjustment for employees who are below the midpoint, because that is equal to what a step is, and then provide at least equal to that or more for those who are past the midpoint and to the maximum. So that's our merit pool. So there's a level of equity we want to try to maintain, so all staff have a equitable increase from year over year related to performance. And then from there, we could consider some catch-up mechanism based on seniority, for instance, to put people at their appropriate step for the years of service underneath a hybrid model. So I kind of know I've thrown a bunch there in a kind of quick order, but I'd be happy to hear the council's feedback if they think a hybrid model helps achieve the direction they like to see the organization go in terms of compensation.
Alderman Stralchik.
So I've got questions. I like the pool analogy, by the way. If we give a cost of living increase like we have in years past, what happens to the ranges? Do all the ranges go up by that cost of living percent? So the midpoint goes up?
Yep.
Okay.
Correct.
What you had up on the board assumes that all people are coming in at that low range.
You would have
Is that sustainable, accurate? Like, you know, that's a very train your talent philosophy coming in versus maybe hiring somebody from the outside, you know, another community or something that's got maybe 5 years of experience. And then my third question, because I'll get all three out, is why did you pick 8 years? Because I think if somebody's sitting in a role at their current company, I mean, anywhere, right? I think after 4 or 5 years, they pretty much know it. So I'm wondering if maybe we want to step them up a little earlier so that we've trained that talent, we retain that talent, we don't have to start all over.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So to address your first question, the study completed by GovHR points out, and we'll still remain that flexibility to hire people above just step one, so it can recognize the years of service from another community or their professional experience to date. And two, to address the number of steps, the reason we went with 8 was from a fiscal ability perspective. When your biggest cost center goes up higher than your larger revenue sources, it gets hard to do too much and don't want to get over our skis. For instance, our largest annual revenue is net new construction, and that can be little as 0.5 to 1.5 or thereabouts in a given year. So it's trying to balance the number of steps with our fiscal picture looking forward.
Thank you.
Alderman Parrish.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Justin. My question relates to, I'm looking at the old pay scale, and then I was trying to this was the first time we had seen kind of like a sample of the hybrid, which is a neat concept. Would be curious to flesh out kind of how the merit system would change, but that's not my question. My question was, as I compare what you quickly showed us up there, it looks like the lower step went up in every case, and then the highest step may have come down. And I was just trying to understand the logic behind that, and I had 2 quick ones I was comparing, but you know, like for step 1, the lowest step was 42,000, and then it's going to go up so that the minimum would be 44,000. It's currently 42,000. And then the highest step is currently 58,000, and I wrote down 52,000 is your highest. Oh, but you have a maximum of 60. Can you elaborate on what the maximum is?
So I'm wondering one of 2 things. Perhaps you're looking at a table for 2023 that may be referencing the minimum of that point, because we indexed going into this year up.
Okay.
Up. So that's why the minimum is higher, and then the maximum would have gone up as well. But I'll go double check my numbers to make sure that we're not, as we go through implementation, not changing the minimum and maximums that we otherwise intend to have in place.
Oh, so the mins and maxes will stay the same. It's just the pace at which we move them through it.
Those
Start at
will
the midpoint.
index over time,
Okay,
so you
got it.
want your minimum and maximums to progress with some type of factor. So when you go to the market, you're remaining competitive at roughly the 50th percentile of those that are out there. If we kept our pay ranges stagnant, we would start to fall behind the market, and it'd get harder to attract talent to fill positions. Then two, it reduces the ceiling in which we can retain staff longer term.
That was ultimately my concern,
Yeah.
was you're lowering the ceiling, and then how do we retain
Yeah.
the great staff that we have if
Yeah.
we've set limits?
Yeah.
Great, and this isn't my specialty, so I look forward to hearing from some of my other businessmen, aldermen, and people who know a lot about HR who can weigh in here.
So I've got a quick question. On the lower end where you're progressing through the 8 notches, what happens if you get someone who comes in and really knocks it out of the park? Is there still an ability to get a merit increase above and beyond that? I just want to make sure we're not waiting to get merit till you hit the 50th percentile, because you might have a rock star come in and you want to reward them quicker.
Yeah, that's the type of components we could look into a framework to bring back to the Common Council, if this is the direction you're interested in us to continue to go. We can potentially include in some components that allow that flexibility.
I think we'll need it because sometimes those people know who they are, and if they have the slightest inkling they're falling behind, they tend to look quicker. Just to make sure we don't delay the pay for performance. If they're coming in and killing it, they shouldn't have to wait 8 years to get there, hopefully. Alderman Bach.
I agree with that too. Just a couple questions. It's good. It's an interesting system, but one, what happens if you need to hire? I'm sure there's some positions in the city that are specialized, and you may not get a ton of applicants, and so you sometimes have to pay a little bit extra to get those people. And so I'm wondering, because I can think about a bunch of them, but I'm wondering how that works. And, I think this seems like different. My world was different when I was dealing with HR and school employees, but maybe there's a difference between the public and the private sector. I was kind of more of a keep it real simple, so I'm just wondering if this system will make things easier for you. Do you think it'll make it easier for you, or is it going to be more complicated where people are going to be arguing this step and that step? And I don't think there's any clear system, but do you think this will help make it clearer for you? So those are just my 2 questions.
I think in terms of recruitment, the hybrid approach will be advantageous to the city. I don't think it'll hinder us. And we have the flexibility for specialized positions to look at internally how it compares with other like positions, and provide a starting wage that maybe is different than step 1. It all depends on the opportunity we're seeking to fill. But I don't think this approach model will necessarily handcuff us.
And specialized positions, you still think you can do that within this
Mhm.
system? Like you'll have a pot of money and say, all right. Now that still might put it out of whack a little bit because you're going to get somebody up here then.
Yeah, we still look to maintain that position within the authorized salary range. To go outside of that, we would typically come before the council if that's needed.
Alderman Hancher.
I'm in favor of the hybrid because I think employees they want to know where they're going. So at least they have from year to year, they know their salary will be going. And in addition to the merit, I think that sends a clear message that they know where they're going in the organization, and that there's no question, am I going to get a pay raise or not? And so this is a roadmap for them to understand that they are going to where their pay is going to go potentially.
course, if we have a bad fiscal year like COVID, it might not happen, but it's hard to predict where the economy is going to go a year from now, much less 10. Alderman Meyer.
This probably dovetails in, and it may have answered the question inside of it. So when we normally advertise for somebody for hire, we normally give a range, inside there for it. So, and we hire somebody in, let's say, at the mid-range already inside of that because of experience and things like that. Do you think it'd be better, instead of coming back to the common council each time, to have some kind of mechanism inside there for those cases when that does happen, that they do have some additional steps that they can go to, instead of having to, that we would pre-approve kind of that, instead of having to come back every time if something like the situation happened?
So I switched to the example pay plan. So I just to make sure I understand, are you suggesting if we need to hire above the maximum, that there's the opportunity for staff to administratively manage that? Or you're thinking at the midpoint? Because right now, if we hire someone, we can depending on the position, sometimes we advertise a starting rate, and other times we advertise a range. And we would look to bring someone in within the minimum maximum, based off their experience and internal equity. And if someone that we look to hire, because we couldn't fill a position elsewise, would exceed the maximum, historically we've come back before the council to provide the rationale to ask for an amendment to the pay plan to adjust where that position stands in the terms of pay grades.
That answer your question? Okay. Alderman Gebhardt.
Thank you, Mayor. There's really no easy solution, but what I do believe in, based upon my experience, is the better you can define the plan, the more it becomes an incentive-based. I think the trick for us is making sure that it's a bit predictable with the budgets that we're dealing with from a city perspective, because there's not an opportunity to just go out there and sell a bunch of new business or bring in additional revenue to go ahead and cover higher costs. But with that being said, a couple of questions for you along the line of what Alderman Bach was asking you about for maybe special positions. Have you looked at the pay grades by position to make sure that they are classified within the right pay grade? Does that make sense?
Yep. It's part of the compensation study completed by GovHR. They did that for us.
Okay.
Yep.
And then you talk about a merit-based program as they step through and get into the upper 50 percentile of that range. Have you thought about different performance metrics that would, to be able to hit those higher steps and to be able to recognize some of that higher part of the pay scale?
Sure. Yes, most definitely. We would need an evaluation tool implemented for staff to help them know what to work towards, what we're looking for in terms of performance, and then that would then use an equation to dictate overall their increase. So that's something we would bring forward as part of a further refinement as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Alderman Strelchak.
Remind me, on steps 1 through 8, there's still a performance aspect to that, correct?
Yep, correct. So if someone meets or exceeds expectations in a given review period, they can move to that next step. If they're below standards, they're not progressing to the next step. And we can flesh out those details as we go forward, but it could include, like, hey, we're gonna have a 6-month review down the road, and then you could potentially move up to your next step if you're exceeding or meeting expectations. Or there could be harder conversations, such as PIPs and whatnot.
That was known before, kind of tribal knowledge by us, but like in the description, it seemed like there was just a stepped, the general public just watching this, that clarification was very good
Sure.
for them. Dovetailing off of what Alderman Gebhardt recommended, if there's multiple years of exceeds expectations in a role, I think that would be a reasonable accelerator.
Gotcha.
Again, we want to retain the best staff and not lose them because they don't feel they're progressing. And I know the corporate world is hard, because the fastest way to move ahead is to shift roles, right? and we want to reward people for staying. So, yep, thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Sounds like some general consensus around this concept, and there's obviously more details to flesh out, I assume, over the coming months.
Yep, and then we'll come back forward to and a future committee of the whole with that fleshed out framework.
So, Assistant Administrator Shinneman, could you, on that note, just provide the council, assuming there's consensus here this evening, with what that deliverable would look like that we would be seeking to bring back?
Sure. So we look to put some rules to the road and develop a framework or policy to help govern the new system. In the future, it would also mean adopting a new pay plan. Could be at any point as we move forward. It could be part of the upcoming budget cycle as we go into 2025. So you would see those deliverables as well as a evaluation tool be finalized to use in the upcoming cycles.
And we would return to the Common Council with that document in whatever form it takes, whether it's a policy, it's guidelines, it's protocols for administering the pay system starting in 2025. So there'll be one more bite at this apple.
At least one.
And I think it was to Alderman Mayor's point, getting this hashed out before we get into adjusting salaries starting next year. Getting this hashed out in a high level way such that we have the tools and the rules to administer it for existing employees and then any new employees. So, more to come.
All right, any parting comments, or shall we move on to our next topic? All right, everyone looks good. Thank you, Justin. Next, we have discussion on ordinance 2024-1662, an ordinance repealing and recreating Article 11 within Chapter 58 of the Mequon Municipal Code as it relates to floodplain zoning. Mr. Zader will give us a brief intro here.
Yes. First, I guess I'll update you a little bit on some other items that we discussed at our last meeting. We did have a Zoom meeting with the state floodplain managers from the DNR. Alderman Talaco sat in on that meeting. It was rather technical in the content, but unfortunately, it kind of ended up having more questions than answers when I walked out. So there were some things that I learned, but it didn't really give us the aha moment on why things have changed so much along this, especially the Milwaukee River watershed. I can get into those details if you want to know a little bit more about them, but I just would say that there seems to be an issue with the inputs into their model in terms of how they're looking at Mequon. One example I can give you, so I have some pictures on the screen here, and I won't get into full detail, but so this, it's hard to read on here, but so this is the basically the discharge peak rates for the Milwaukee River at our monitoring station, which is on Pioneer Road. And the highlighted numbers are what the flow rate is during a 1% chance, which is our 100-year event, which shows 14,340 cubic feet per second. I did go out and find, this is a screenshot of our peak flow rates for the last basically 20 years for any peak event, which a lot of these were flood events. And you can see from this column here, the highest number is about 6,000. So I questioned the DNR on why are we using a 14,000 number when the highest peak rate I found was 6,000. And the response was, well, let's step back a little bit. They're doing an H&H analysis, that's hydrology and hydraulics. The hydrology portion of the model they did not update. They used the 2007 data, which was also used in 1991, and that data relied on Esterbrook Park's monitoring station because the one at Pioneer Road was only there for 9 years and they didn't want to use that data. So So they used the Estherbrook Park monitoring station, and then they basically interpolated up to Ozaki to come up with that number. So to me, it's a flawed number. I'm not sure how you adjust to it, but the issue is that we think it's wrong, but we have to prove it in some way. We can't just say it's wrong. So that's one example. I did reach out to some other communities. I did talk to Thiensville at great lengths about what they are experiencing. They did file for a LOMAR. They hired Rukert and Milky to do analysis of their floodplain. They said, I did talk to Andy LaFon. He said they did get it down. It's not nearly what it was before, but it has reduced a little bit. They are in the process of submitting a LOMAR F to FEMA, or a LOMAR to FEMA to get that adjusted, but that hasn't been finalized yet. I also did reach out to other communities. West Bend, it sounds like several years ago, did some targeted modeling on the Milwaukee River related to their downtown plan, but it was not their full-blown map change. That actually they just got their preliminary maps last month, so those were more targeted. I did reach out to the Parks director. It was a Parks project. I have not heard back on who did the modeling and what the cost was. Rukert Milky told me their charge was, or Village of Thiensville told me their charge was $27,000 for Rukert Milky, but that's a fairly small section of the Milwaukee River. So I also did ask in our meeting what the cost would be from DNR's perspective with regard to the floodplain, and they just gave me a ballpark figure for just the portion of Little Menominee, and they said, well, anywhere between 10 and 100,000 just for that portion. But they did also caution me that the hydraulics of this was redone, so they basically surveyed from the whole entire Milwaukee River lengths, and they said, well, you're not going to really see any difference in the surveying because it's all been done. So that would be somewhat a waste of money in their opinion, but they really couldn't stop or explain why the difference in the base flood elevation jumped in certain areas by a significant amount. The other thing we found out was at County Line Road, my map just crashed on me, sorry. At County Line Road, we found out that the modeling that was done to the Milwaukee River in Milwaukee County was more recent than ours, and they actually have a higher base flood elevation at the county line, which means that there's a reverse waterfall in a sense that goes up. So they were making the argument that yours was artificially low to begin with, and now we're just adjusting it to match that model. So that was another thing I was kind of surprised out. And the third thing was this area here, this is the across from River Barn Park. This area here was where I think this most significant change to the floodplain is occurring. There's two separate modeling studies that occurred, one for the Trinity Creek section, which is back in here, and one for the Milwaukee River. And my question to them was, well, where does one stop and one start? And they said, well, Cedarburg Road, even though there's not really a definite break between the Milwaukee River and Trinity Creek. There's a lot of backwater from Milwaukee River, and then there's drainage water coming this way. So, and then I asked about all these LOMAs that were issued in here. Is that going to be something that they're going to have to issue again? And they basically stated that they looked at all those LOMAs, and they looked at the elevations taken through the survey, and that these people won't be eligible for LOMAs anymore because the new base flood elevation exceeds their LOMAs. So I think this is an area where we're really going to be hit with a lot of new people that are being in the floodplain based on the survey. So, so that's kind of my little summary from what our meeting occurred from last time. If you have any specific questions about that, I can get into that. If you want to get into the ordinance, we can get into the ordinance changes.
Well, we're on a timeline with the DNR for the ordinance, the model ordinance changes, so we should probably hit that, because you have to submit that, correct, to WDNR, and they have to hear back that it's okay, and all that has to get done by July.
Well, I was just going to update you on that as part of the ordinance change. I did submit this version to the DNR last couple of weeks ago. She did get back to me today. She said everything in the ordinance was acceptable except 2 points where there were minor technical points. One was just the mapping identification, which has already been fixed, and another one had to do with penalties clause, which Brian has already adjusted. So they want to see it again, but everything else in the ordinance they have no issues with.
Okay, so by and large, what we saw in our packet, they've sort of softly approved, but not.
Yes, they've
okay.
blessed for the most part.
Let's have a little bit of discussion on that if there is any, and then we can move on and see how much time we have for the rest. Alderman Talaco.
All right, Jack, thank you so much. Great information for everyone. It kind of cuts out some things. I prepared something to kind of state prior to this meeting, and here it is. So I've been researching the floodway matter for years, and this was actually one of the reasons that motivated me to run for alderwoman. Born and raised, third generation Mequonite, I've known the struggles that the citizens have faced in regards to where the property rights begin and the DNR state govern. My goal coming was to better understand the three main moving parts in this problem: where the power lies within the state of Wisconsin, the Wisconsin DNR, and the city of Mequon. I've been working diligently with the Wisconsin Legislative Council, a state senator, the citizens of Mequon, and the city, in order to obtain the answers that are needed to properly represent, understand, and support our citizens. While the state of Wisconsin has granted the majority of the power to the Wisconsin DNR in regards to the floodway, it doesn't heed the city helpless. Here is what I see are the biggest problems in adopting these maps and the revisions proposed tonight to the Chapter 58 Code of Floodway that I see. The new firm maps show increases of 12 to 14 inches in base flood elevation throughout the floodway, expanding in areas that have never historically seen these levels, even when going all the way back to 1918 and 1924, the worst floods that have ever been seen in Mequon, followed by perhaps the more memorable floods in 2007-08. These new levels will affect at least 200 homes and an uncalculated number of new homes. The changes that have been inserted for peace of mind by having a numeric number such as in section 2.0 general flood standards specifying 2 feet or 1 foot causes a greater restriction to the current residents. At the last committee of the whole, the council unanimously agreed to go the route of less restrictive, not greater. Additionally, with the continuously moving goalposts demonstrated by these new maps and base flood elevations, how can residents ever really comply to any of these standards if they continue to raise the flood elevation? They are caught in a vicious hamster wheel, and these numeric changes only add to it and cause a larger burden on the residents. Yes, I know there are arguments as to why they may make sense. But why these numbers might look and feel great on paper, they're artificial in nature, holding no true value, and ultimately taking us further away from our goal of making the rules less restrictive for our residents. For peace of mind, the Wisconsin Legislative Code and the city of Mequon already cover that if a house was ever to sustain substantial damages, which to date these houses have not, as no flood has caused this amount of damage, the house could only be rebuilt using the most current standards at the current time when such event occurred. That clause is sufficient in and of itself, and there is no need to add any further numbers. I also urge that the 25 square foot ingress-egress for a roof be removed along with any CRS modifiers. In conclusion, this is what I'm asking. Remove any additional numeric modifiers in any CRS criteria. I urge the council to set aside funding for Mequon to do its own engineer study in order to take back any and all land that has unjustifiably been taken from our residents. I've spoken to surrounding communities, all who have done their own studies, all who were able to take back parts of their land. Our land is our #1 resource, and it should stay in the hands of Mequon and the residents who currently own it. I further ask the Common Council to take a stronger stance for the residents of Mequon by pushing back at every chance when the DNR tries to take any more of our land or audits us for bogus activities that residents should have the right to on their land. The land is owned by the residents, not the DNR. Mequon has the longest standing flood mitigation and development control in the county. It is time that the DNR starts respecting us, starts working with us, and that we stop catering to their unrealistic and unreasonable demands. I will leave you with one last thought. If you shorten a dog's chain every day by just an inch, until the chain is so short he won't be able to move. He will never resist because he is conditioned to the loss of his freedom slowly over time. This is what has happened to our residents, and it's time to stop allowing it. So I respectfully ask each of you to support me in these requests, and let's stop this land grab on our city and residents and fight for every inch back. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments on the ordinance? Jack, maybe refresh us. Is there language in our proposed ordinance that is reflective of the community rating system?
Yes, at the last meeting, we decided to leave it in for now, and we can pull it out at any time because it's an extra bonus that we would have, the DNR wouldn't have an issue with us removing. And I can go through in the comment section, it shows everywhere there's a CRS requirement that's an addition. Most of these really don't apply here. The first one I believe is going to be under the general floodplain. We don't really have general floodplain here that has structures on them, so those won't apply. The biggest issue that we do have with them is in areas where the flood fringe, here, I'll just kind of go through. So this is one of the sections where this does apply. So flood fringe, you have to, under the ordinance, it's basically at the regional flood elevation. If we are a CRS community, you have to be 1 foot above. So this applies to properties that we're going to rebuild. So they would have to build 1 foot higher than the base flood elevation. Now, again, that's totally voluntary. We don't have to do that, but I guess it does protect us. Like if we would have adopted higher standards earlier, and some of these properties would be actually probably still out of the floodplain because of the elevation change if we would have made them go up higher earlier. So there's not, I mean, when you're rebuilding or you're tearing down something and building new, going up an additional foot, there's not a substantial cost to that. So, but again, if that's something that the council wants to remove, just let me know and I can pull that out. That's relatively easy. There's only a few sections in the code that really are applicable. The worst ones with regard to going up 2 feet and 3 feet are in areas like this one section here. This is the general floodplain section. We don't really have any AO or AH zones in Mequon, so these really won't apply here. This is where it requires you to go from 2 foot to 3 foot. And these are just really not applicable here. So if we want to take them out, we can, but there's really no areas in Mequon that really these apply to. The other thing that she mentioned was the issue with the deck. There's a section in here, I'll have to get to it 1 second, 6.1 I believe it is. Let me see if I can find it. Page 21, I'm getting there. So yeah, there's a section here that says the language says there's a construction of a deck that does not exceed 200 square feet in area and that is adjacent to an exterior wall or principal structure is not an extension, modification, or addition. The roof of the structure may extend over a portion of the deck in order to provide safe ingress and egress in the principal structure. We had this discussion at Planning Commission. Staff would prefer to see a number there, not just leave it vague. This is a new section that the DNR added. The previous section allowed to have just a deck. It didn't allow for any overhang to provide ingress egress. So this is something they added new. When I asked them about what this criteria was, they didn't have an answer for me. They said, well, that's really up to you guys to decide. And I don't want to be the one to decide that. So I would prefer to have some sort of number placed on that. I mean, there could be people that want to do roof over all 200 square foot of it, which by definition is no longer a deck, because the deck is by definition uncovered. So there should be a standard in there that dictates what that is. Originally we had it at 9. I did increase it to 16 square feet. So if you have a doorway, you'd have a 4x4 roof over that doorway that would provide safety from the weather coming in and out. Or if you had a patio door, that you would provide cover over. But if that's not large enough, I would just suggest that we make it a number that we can all rely on going forward. Because there are going to be issues where people don't have any doors or have one door going in and out of onto the deck, but they want to cover all 200 square foot of it, and it's really not a deck anymore. So I just want to be consistent so that if somebody says, why are they allowed to do that? Why can't I do that? I would just say the number is what it is. So those are really the few things in this ordinance that we actually modified. So, again, I'm not sure. I don't have a strong feeling about it one way or another. I just want more clarity and less ambiguity in the code.
So let's tackle the topic of the few and potentially not all that impactful community rating system requirements. Is there general consensus from the council to keep them in or remove them? Open to some discussion on that. We'll just try to break this up into pieces so we can get somewhere on it. Does anyone else have a strong opinion one way or the other? It doesn't look like anyone's speaking up. How about the square footage of the overhang over the door? Was the 14-foot or the 16 square foot number discussed at Planning Commission? I missed last month's meeting, so.
Well, originally it was 9 at Planning Commission, and then they didn't think that was large enough, but they didn't really come up with a number. They said just think about it and come up with something. We looked at potentially 4x4 or 5x5 as an area just to cover the stairway or the doorway that you come in. There is no other building code standard that dictates any kind of cover for ingress, egress. There's nothing in the commercial code, so again, whatever we decide on, it's pulling a number basically, just on what you feel comfortable with.
Okay, Alderman Strelchak.
Yeah, just to give you a little feedback on that, there was some back and forth. I was advocating for more. Some people were saying it was fine. The main issue that was brought up is, some people are going to enter through an entry door, which is 3 feet wide, and that would require one size. But then what if it's a sliding door? And I'm thinking of, a building that I have, with a sliding door, and I don't have anything over it. And when the rain comes and I slide that door open, I get water like 2-3 feet sometimes if there's a driving wind into the facility. So I would advocate for up to 40 feet. It would be 4 foot by 10 feet long to be allowed over a sliding door. I don't really care if we cover or allow them to cover things or not. I mean, I think the river's so restrictive anyway. We're not trying to do a covered deck, but allow them a little flexibility on the egress if they wanted. I recommend a higher number than what I had support for at Planning Commission. And then I do have other points to bring up, but I'll save those for later because they have to do with the report and then points of data.
Alderwoman Tlaco.
I think that NR 116.151 AS, which states, the roof of a principal structure to extend over a portion of the deck in order to provide safe ingress and egress to the principal structure is sufficient. I do not believe there needs to be a number. Putting a number, it says a portion of it. Everyone knows that is to be interpreted as that you cannot put it over the entire deck. Furthermore, if you're putting a number, depending on the design or style of the house, we're going to get into design issues and conceptual issues where putting only 16 square feet over an area might look rather silly. This also to keep in mind is it's a 200 square foot deck is not considered a modification. You can have a deck that is larger than 200 square feet. So you're going to tell me that if I want to build a 400 square foot deck, which I've got in legal opinion on it, that is allowable, how silly is that little space going to look with only that portion of it being covered? It's aesthetically not going to be pleasing. It does not need a number. It needs to be interpreted as that it can extend over a portion of the deck in order to provide, and I think we need to leave it as such.
Looking for other opinions on that. Anyone want to offer a different number or make a motion to? You can do whatever we want with it. That part is ours. Alderman Parrish.
I thought we were making that change because it's required by the DNR. So if we're not, I don't know why we're adding in.
Well, again, if there is not a number placed on it, then it's going to come down to staff's interpretation on every single one of them. And so then,
it always goes through
if it's going to be me, I'm
review.
going to look at it and say, you only need it over the doorway, so it's gonna be 16 square feet or something like that. It's not, if I had to interpret this ordinance, I would not allow someone to put 100 square foot of decking or roofing over a deck
Yeah.
just because they have one door. So,
Well, that's the
Or we
flip side.
approve
If
it,
you don't put a
so-
number on it, you'll get 199 because it's not the whole deck, but it's almost all of it.
What are
Otherwise,
we
we'll be hearing about
protecting
it all the
though?
time at Planning Commission.
I have a comment.
Alderwoman Schneider.
I'm wondering if we can't phrase it, because Alderman Strelchek was referencing that sometimes people have a wider door. Could we just put to extend 4 feet out from the width of a door that accesses the deck? Then if they have a longer door, that it would be a different number, but it would be functionally still just an overhang for egress and ingress, and I think that would do the trick.
so for the openable part of the door, like a slider, because those will only be 3 foot wide typically. Most patio doors don't really slide the whole way. So,
Then I would do it for the whole door. I mean, I'd rather not have partial coverage aesthetically. I think for the width of the door structure, which would include probably 5 feet, I'm assuming, and then 4 feet out from that.
Yeah, they're usually 6 or 8 feet wide, but yeah, just so there's balance. That's a better solution, I think, perhaps. Alderman Meyer.
Question, could we have it that it could not exceed a percentage of the deck instead of having an actual footage marked out on that?
I don't think we can adjust the section that talks about ingress egress. So, and I did ask that to the DNR rep when she met with me about this ordinance, and she didn't really have an answer on what that meant in terms of how we enforce that. She's like, that's really up to you to enforce. So, I just think it's a new they must have had some issues with some properties around the state where this came up, because it was not in the last version. The language with the 200 square foot was in the last version, but there must have been some issues with people having complaints about having an overhang over the doorway or something. So, but they didn't really, they must not have got into it and level into detail.
Well, I like
So you would
Alderwoman Schneider's
recommend-
proposal because it defines it, and it's broad enough where there's flexibility. If there's one door or two, or there's a larger patio door, we don't have to be locked into a number, but there's an expectation that it's in the area where the ingress and egress happens, and it's defined how far you can go out, and then the rest is just math.
I still
So
think you
I'll
could
make
do-
a motion for that, actually.
I
I'll
still
just
think you could
make
do that and just have it that, for that area there, and just say cannot exceed, let's say 30% of the deck, or whatever the heck it is. to cover
I
that.
think the challenge though with a percentage is that you're assuming that everybody's going to maximize the deck to the full 200 square feet that might be allowable. You could certainly have a deck that is only the 3 or 4 foot wide to get up to the stairs that you'd look to have, there's a little landing outside of the door that you'd want to have full coverage on, versus somebody who has a 200 square foot deck that maybe only has that small area that's there. So I think a percentage becomes more tricky just because you have different sizes of decks that potentially could be there.
There is an offer of an amendment proposal, but there's no seconder on that motion. I think she did.
I move that it's changed to a 4 foot extending over the entire length of any door.
Add
structure.
in a couple feet on either side.
No.
It's gonna look dumb if you stop it right at the door.
They typically overhang a little bit.
They overhang a little bit, so it'd be 4
Architecturally.
So,
feet
yeah, you
plus a
probably
couple
have seen
feet
more-
wider
more-
than the
more
door.
aesthetic issues and planning commission. So what do you think would be a reasonable number on the side of a door?
I said 40 because it was, assume an 8-foot door, it's 10 feet wide, and then it extends out 4 feet. I picked that number based on your premise right there for a patio door. It gives Jack something to work with if there's a single egress, and they've got a nice design, tied in with some other things, along with it, maybe some stonework or something, or some additional, raised area or whatever. And it looks nice. It gives staff the liberty to approve something like that. So, that's why I recommended what I recommended.
So you're recommending that, though, still in an ingress situation.
Egress
correct? Not
situation,
like they can
correct.
have a separate area of their patio.
Me personally, I don't care if they make it significantly bigger and they can cover as much of the deck as they want, because that's how they want to live in their space. You know, I agree 100% with Alderwoman Tolaco on that one. So I have a hard time limiting it. I want it as loose as possible, but I don't want people to target the maximum. And but we do need something. I agree with what Jack Zader's stating, is that we do need something for staff to kind of come up with a number. So the worst thing, like when I came into office, everything seemed like it was an art show, right? It was subjective. People would have opinions on this, and we can change it based on what we feel. Something equitable that we can clearly define and clearly describe. From an aesthetic standpoint, no more than 4 feet out and or 2 feet wider on either side of the door entry, would be a reasonable parameter without throwing an exact number on it. That would get to the 40 for a sliding door. If they had 2 doors, they could add an additional one or do whatever they needed to do. But again, it gives something for staff to work with, which I like, but it also gives freedom to the resident to live in the space however they want with the least amount of restrictions. Like, not one of us cares if we're going to go to a patio party and it's covered by a 4x4 space or 100 square feet. We're just going to think the space is cool, and that's what everyone else is going to think it is. But we just need something equitable for staff to be able to, okay, it's not a covered deck, and here's what that means. There's a process and a description so that we can clarify what our standards are, to people as they come in and ask for things.
I just want to clarify, because I think we're maybe missing something here, is that the 200 square foot limitation in this section does not prohibit from anybody from doing other things. What it does do is you don't have to count this portion of it as part of your 50%. And in the way I interpret it, which I got pushback from DNR, but the way I read it, it makes sense that you do not need any H&H study to do this. So if you were going to put a 400 square foot deck with a full roof over it, you would not be able to use this section of the code. So you would have to do a full H&H study, and you would also then have to impact your 50 percentile if you're on Act 175 property. So people have options yet. This is only basically kind of like we're giving you this kind of with no penalty. So that there's a difference there.
This is what you get with no hassle of an H&H.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I still like Alderwoman Schneider's suggestion at 4 feet. If someone wanted to wrap their whole space with patio doors, you could have it around the whole thing. It's the least restrictive of anything, but just defining a distance from the building, you can have more doors and you have more covered area because you're not limiting it. That's the easiest, the most flexibility. It's going to guarantee you're not covering the whole thing unless the deck is a 4-foot wraparound. But that's not likely to occur.
So would you be interested in having it say sticking out no more than 4 feet from a door, and the width of the door plus 1 foot on each side?
Something reasonable like that, yeah.
Okay.
Very, very flexible and still defined. It won't come down on staff to have to constantly interpret it. Alderman Parrish.
Are we just voting on that one slice of it, or are we? Because I have more questions. Okay.
One issue at a time. Yeah,
Right.
I'm hoping to get through that issue. We can talk about CRS
Oh man, we have a lot to
provisions
go.
next.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, let's do a straw poll on that real quickly, then we'll move on to the next one. Who supports in general that concept of 4 feet in front of a door plus minus a foot on either side, regardless of the size of the door?
I like 2 feet, but so right there.
If it's 2 feet, will you vote for it? Yes. Okay, 2 feet. Okay, 2 feet. There we go. Okay. Let's consider that one done for now. We're getting back to the provisions for the community rating system. It sounded like there's not a lot of impact so the upside of CRS is we can maybe save money on flood insurance for some people.
If we decide in the future to participate in the CRS program, you get a reduction in flood insurance for the people that live here for every number you go down. So you start at 10, and then you go down 9, down 8, down 7. The lower you go, I think it's at 5% each step you go down. That would save the individuals that pay flood insurance here on their premiums. This itself does not do that. This is just provisions that you would have to build into that CRS program if you were going to do that.
Oh, so if we're gonna do it, we have to have these provisions in the code.
This is one of the areas that you have to focus on. Yes.
Okay. And this is or isn't more of a hassle for staff to administer?
Once, if we want to get in the program, there's a lot of paperwork involved to get in the program. This portion of it is relatively easy, but if we decide at a future date to go into the CRS program, then that is a little bit more paperwork to get the whole.
And we could
process.
always adopt these provisions later if we
Could.
wanted to get
Yeah,
into it.
You could.
Okay, so I'll pose a question. We can always choose to get into this later, so if we leave it out, it's out for now. We can choose at a later date to get back in. And it sounds like even if we include these provisions now, we're not committing to being in the program because that's a whole nother set of hoops to jump through.
Yeah, there's more to it than just this. You have to do outreach. You have to.
Yeah,
provide
there's a
data,
whole,
yeah.
it's an investment.
Yes.
So it sounds to me like, yeah, it's maybe
So
potentially wise to stay out and decide to get in later.
how much does this impact the residents? Are we in this program currently, or we're not in the
We are
program?
not in the program right now.
So currently, the residents, if they are paying flood insurance separately, which some people probably have to do, are accommodated to that.
They're paying their full premium. So, and if we were in and we were a 9, they'd get a 5% reduction in their premium cost. If we were at 8, they'd get 10%.
I see.
I think Elm Grove is the lowest community in Wisconsin. They're at a 5. So the residents there get 35% off their premium. So it saves them money. The whole point of it is to educate the public on the floodplain and build in a certain way that limits your risk, and then you get rewarded by getting lower premiums for the residents that live there. So it's a benefit to the residents that pay flood insurance.
Yep, straw poll. We can always choose to get in later, but if we choose to stay out now, it might make this less complicated. Sure,
Just
go
one
ahead.
interjection is that it is a benefit absolutely to get money off on your flood insurance, right? But the problem is that they're raising the base flood elevation by 12 to 14 inches, so they're moving the goalposts. So while it sounds like it's good on the front, the residents won't be able to comply. So this isn't helping
Well,
the people that live there.
I
So
agree. We're
this-
not debating the merits of the
Right,
most
but
likely
it's coming across
flawed
as
modeling
like, oh,
system.
you're gonna save money on flood insurance, that's great, let's save these residents money. And
Just
it's
trying to
like-
get through the ordinance section of this, because we have to get this finalized so we can get it back to WDNR. I agree that, from what I heard from Jack, and we've talked about it at length in our staff meetings, that DNR and FEMA have made a bit of a mess, but we have to do this we have to do the model ordinance portion and get those ducks in a row so we can get our people insured. Otherwise, their insurance is gonna stop in July, which we don't want either. The modeling fiasco using the wrong flow rates is another topic for another day. It's kind of a big problem that needs to get addressed in my view, but we can't do that tonight. I would just want to get through the model ordinance. So the straw poll is the CRS provisions in or out, noting that we can put them back in later. So if you support keeping them in, raise your hand. Well, this is easy. I know the inverse of this one. If you would like to see them removed for the time being, raise your hand. Okay. Okay, that one's easy. Is that the remainder of what we need input on for the model ordinance?
I mean, most of the other stuff that we changed in here were wordsmithing, legal. I mean, unless you have certain questions or concerns over some of the language in here, the rest of it is relatively minor changes that we've made, because we're not really allowed to do much else to it. So it was clarifications. It was, Brian reviewed some of the language on changing ordinance to article, things like that. I clarified areas where I think was vague and put in a definition to them that was already there, but it just wasn't clear. So there really wasn't a lot of other substantive changes to this ordinance.
Okay, I had one follow-up question from our meeting this morning. Were we able to find that section of our proposed model ordinance where it talked about the maps and the revisions thereof?
Yes, I think Brian was looking at that, and you wanted some language change. That's right at the beginning. I can get to that.
The language seemed to suggest that we would be looking back at old versions of old maps and using the most restrictive of any of them, and I'd like to, my goal would be to only operate to current maps, not
Yeah, I
old
think what-
versions of maps.
What you're referring to is on page 5. It says, if more than one map or revision is referenced, the most restrictive information shall apply. In the event that the maps adopted by this article are in conflict with previously adopted maps, the most restricted information and provision shall apply. I think what we're trying to do there, and maybe we can work on the languages, we're trying to incorporate our zoning maps that in areas that are not covered by FEMA, because right now they are zoned floodway, and if we don't add some language in here, those are kind of no man's land at this point. So we have to do something temporarily until we decide to change the maps, our zoning maps, to match these FEMA maps. But again, if we want to change the model or go try to challenge the modeling and those maps change anyway, then I don't know if we make a change right
Well,
now
the,
or not.
the specific language, and this is in, man, we're reading the red line version. If more than one map or revision is referenced, I'm fine with more than one map because we have FEMA maps, we have the little Menominee, we have our zoning map, but it's the revision. So that would call into every previous revision of every FEMA map and every, I don't want there to be any confusion over that.
Yeah, I agree, because there's stuff in the actual 2007 FEMA maps that are changing to be less restrictive. Brian, that's the red's Brian language. I'll have to have him look at that and see how he wants to
Yeah,
reword
I think
that.
it was just the revision part that.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that as I looked at it, and I didn't have a chance to really look at potential language for it, we really just need to reference the zoning map specifically in that language, and that's something that we can do. It's a relatively easy change. I just
Okay.
didn't have anything prepared for it.
Okay, so we'll clean that up a little bit, but before we send it back for finals, okay. That was my last question. If there are no other questions on the model ordinance, let's get them out there now. Otherwise, what else do we need a decision point on tonight? I think
really
this was
about
the
it.
big thing to get through. After learning what you learned and hearing it from you about how the maps were done, I have more questions as well. Trust me, water can't be flowing back upstream at the county line, and I can't see any reason why they would be using numbers that are 2 times what our worst flood event in the last 20 years are. That just, I can't comprehend where they think that's a good decision.
I mean, the only thing I added in here was the adoption of those little Menominee study maps, because I did reach out to Sewer Pack. As I stated earlier, the little Menominee study was done by Sewer Pack years ago. DNR approved it in January of 2022 and basically stated that anytime you want to submit this to FEMA, go ahead. And I reached out to the Sewer Pack, and they said they haven't even submitted it to FEMA yet, and they have a backlog of things they need to submit, so it could be years before that actually gets submitted and approved by FEMA. So we're just going to adopt that as part of this study as a separate study, basically.
That seems like the consistent thing to do. Alderman Bach.
Just a quick question. I think last time we talked about, I think there was some discussion about notifying residents affected by this, or maybe doing a session or something like that. Is that something that's still in the parking lot, or is that just too complicated?
Yes, we decided we did not want to slow down this process because there really is much we could do about it. So I think what we decided on is like late May, having an open house, discussing it with the neighbors, letting them know what we found, and then letting them know that there may be a potential challenge to the modeling at a future date. But we didn't want to hold up this process and risk people not being in the flood, having flood insurance. So we didn't want to do this as part of the public hearing, which will be happening in May for this particular ordinance.
Perfect. Thank you.
Alderwoman Delaco.
I think that sounds great, and I think that this warrants an actual mailing to the residents, not just like a posting or a note card. I would like to see that people affected by this would actually get a letter in their mailbox. I think it's that important to acknowledge this and that we're taking the matter serious.
We can work out those details. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it can be done. It's just a little bit more work involved to try to identify everybody. And you say, I would say affected, anybody within that floodplain would have to be affected, because I don't know what their elevation of their house is and the details specific to their particular property. So anybody that touches a floodplain boundary would have
You'd
to
have
be
to cast a wide net, otherwise it'd take countless hours to assess.
figure that out.
Yeah. Alderman Strelchek, and then I'm gonna let Administrator Jones get a word in here for a second.
Yep. Alderman Bach, were you asking in specific about an open house? Because that's what I brought up at the last meeting, was an open house versus as we're reviewing the ordinance. So we talked about late May, but then we also talked about it as an agenda item. Well, that is a little different than an open house. I think it's important if we do a mailing and we just have even a one-night thing where we have an open house where we can just casually explain to people. It'll save staff, I think, a ton of time. I think it'll save the residents a lot of heartache on this. And I think it embodies the true transparency in government that everybody hopes to have, as, you know, hey, we're working on your behalf and here's what we're doing for you, to try to at least help you understand what's there. And then we're looking at what we can do to support you and allow your home to be the most, you know, livable space available.
I think what we were envisioning was a presentation like I gave at the last committee of the whole with some updates to it, and then getting general questions from residents, and then if there's more detail they wanted, specifics about their property, then I would meet with them one-on-one at one point.
Your vision is completely different than mine.
What would you like me to do?
Like that I-43 open house where we had some things out on big.
I think you're in
printouts on the
violent
table.
agreement. I think that's exactly what they plan. Maps, stuff up. There'll be a little bit of time before, there'll be a presentation, there'll be a little bit of time after. It's exactly the same.
But he mentioned it as a committee of the whole, and that's.
No.
That's,
No.
Oh.
Open house.
Okay,
Yeah,
sorry, I heard it different than what you just said.
Yeah, I did say
My apologies.
Yeah, we don't want I'd rather get all those questions taken care of rather than people in the
Yeah.
audience. So that was the.
All right. We're good for tonight, at least. I think we're done with this. Any parting shots, Administrator Jones?
Thank you, Mayor. Just to bring it full circle here, and thank you, Assistant Director Zader. Assuming we make the minor edits that the council has consented to here this evening, Mr. Zader, you pointed out that the DNR has tacitly approved what is on the agenda this evening.
She did, but she did want to see the changes to those two sections, and then I will include those two sections, and then the other sections we talked about, I will send it back to her probably before the end of this week. And my guess is she'll get back to me prior to May. I don't know if that's me or who that is.
Yeah.
So I'm sure she'll get back to me before May's council meeting to let us know whether they approved it or not.
And as noted in the memo, this evening, the Planning Commission took action on this item at their meeting in March and unanimously approved adoption of the ordinance by a vote of 8-0.
Yep.
And then in consulting with the city attorney here during discussion, this item will likely be on the Public Welfare Committee agenda for recommendation to the council at next month's meeting in advance of proposed adoption at the May meeting. So just clarifying next steps as we march forward on this process. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll hit the Committee of the Whole planning calendar real quick. Any comments on that real quick? If not, you can always email me and complain about I don't think so, because it's got to go back to WDNR and we'll probably approve it at a later date.
Public welfare there, we wouldn't need a motion. It's going to get recommended through a body.
Yeah, just a discussion item. And so we can adjourn and then immediately reconvene if someone has a different committee. If someone wants to make a motion to adjourn.
Motion.
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.